Dungeons and Dragons has evolved dramatically over the past 50 years, but which years were the most pivotal? Join me as I count down the top 5 most critical years in D&D history where the game took its most significant leaps forward, today on Daddy Rolled a 1. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. Today, I'm going to be talking about the 5 most crucial, pivotal years in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, things that propelled the game forward, that had an impact on us playing over 50 years later in some cases. And because my channel does focus for the majority on the TSR era of Dungeons and Dragons, so pre-Wizards of the Coast, all 5 of my pivotal years are going to be during that time period, during the TSR ownership of the game. However, I did think about a couple of instances where there were years during the Wizards of the Coast tenure of owning the game that are very important. And so what I did was I put together sort of like 5 honorable mentions, I guess you could call them, to talk about, some other things before I get into my core 5 crucial years in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. So I picked my years based on a few different criteria, one being the products that were released that year for the game, for Dungeons and Dragons, what came out and what was the legacy of those products? How important were they? What was the impact that they had on the future of the game decades after their publication? I also looked at the products that were published from a standpoint of the impact that they had on sort of, I guess, pop culture in a very generic sense, but more specifically on the culture of Dungeons and Dragons. So when D&D started out, of course, it didn't have its own built-in culture. That culture developed over time. And there are certain cases where specific products or supplements or whatever you want to call them were published that then helped to redefine, or in some cases to define for the first time, how Dungeons and Dragons aesthetic, its look, its vibe, its feel, whatever you want to say, how that became integral to how people think about Dungeons and Dragons, both those who play the game as well as how outsiders perceive the game, people who don't play it, whether it's the media or just, random people hearing about the game. And then third, one of the things that I looked at was what was going on at the company at the time, what was happening at TSR, or in a couple cases, my honorable mentions, Wizards of the Coast, what was happening that it had an impact on the way that the game was being developed and, from a business standpoint. Okay, so that was kind of my criteria. I didn't, assign values to them or anything. This is all just kind of gut feel. If you've watched my channel for long enough, you probably might have some guesses as to which years I'm probably going to put onto my list. So don't look at the timestamps, but maybe you could make a game out of it. So get out a notebook, jot them down what you think are going to be my top 5 crucial years, or also just use that as a comparison for what you think I should have picked or what you would have picked were you making this video, and then leave that in the comments below and let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on my list and also specific years that you think I should have included or maybe moved up higher on the list, that kind of thing. So when I get into my honorable mentions, I'm going to do them in chronological order from earliest to latest. But for my top 5, my crucial pivotal top 5, I'm going to present them in what I think is probably for me going to be order of importance leading up to the most important year. So I did debate about this a lot. I've been going back and forth, and I've actually changed the order of it several times. And I'll talk about that when I get there. But I would like to ask that if you enjoy this kind of historical content, if you like these deep dives into the history of tabletop role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, or my deep dives of different products, or if you like my DM advice, my campaign updates, and my reviews of independent tabletop role-playing games products, then please like my video and subscribe to my channel. And very important to hit the bell icon so that you'll be notified when I upload new content such as this one. And if you can, it's very important for the algorithm if you can do that within the first hour of me publishing the video. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in and start talking about my honorable mentions. And I'm going to start off, I said it was going to go chronologically. So I'm starting off with this. This is the 1974 release of Dungeons and Dragons. Again, later printing that I have. The original one was that wood grain box, but this is essentially what the game was, the three booklets with the, whoops, I have couple extra booklets that I shoved in my box here. So, but these three booklets with the reference sheets. Okay, and this was the original game. Now, this is kind of a cheat, and some of you might be wondering, like, well, why is this like only an honorable mention? Like, this should be the top or the most important thing. But I kind of looked at it from the standpoint of like, well, you can't have a top 5 list of the most important years in Dungeons and Dragons until after the game's published, right? So this is 1974. Release of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, something else happens in 1974 that I think is pretty cool to think about, which is that's the year that Lawrence Schick and Tom Moldvay worked together to develop what's going to become known as the known world in Dungeons and Dragons. So they created a campaign setting the very year that this came out for use with this game. And in 1981, they were able to take that campaign setting and put it into the expert set that was published in 1981 by Dave Cook and Steve Marsh. And that campaign setting is eventually going to come to be known as Mystera. In the kind of the mid to late 80s, there was a name shift from the known world to calling it Mystera. So that's the whole Gazetteer line, if you've ever heard of those. So that starts in 1974 as well. All right, so that's my first honorable mention. Now I'm going to jump to 1978. And this was a hard year to not include in my top 5, but we have a few things going on that year. For me, probably the most important thing that happens during that year is the publication of the first adventure module for Dungeons and Dragons. I say most important thing, it's very, very close, but Dungeons and Dragons, at least TSR, had not published any adventures until this, except for Temple of the Frog that was included in the Blackmore supplement. I just talked about that in my last video. But there was kind of a thinking at TSR that they weren't going to publish adventures. And so other people started doing it for them. So We Warriors published, I believe, the very, very first one. It was the Vampire Queen, Palace of the Vampire Queen, something like that. And then Judges Guild was also publishing adventures as well. And so by 1978, TSR had been writing adventures because they were running them at conventions. So a lot of these first adventures were adventures that were first run at conventions, used as tournament play. But the only way that you could really get a hold of them is maybe you might be lucky enough to be at that convention and you might be able to get a copy of the ones that were sold, very limited print runs, and, not the kind of the layout, the art, the design, and that kind of thing that we're used to. So for this to come out, G1, 1978, there's a whole kind of like this starts to set the stage of what adventures are going to be like. But it's not the only one that's published in 1978. It's just the first one. I have a whole video on G1 and the history behind TSR publishing these modules if you want to hear more about that, why they didn't want to publish adventures in the first place and how then they got into it. But G2 also comes out that year, as well as G3, which I don't own a G3 separately. I own just the combination G1, 2, 3, but I do have G1 and 2. But D1, 2, and 3 came out that year. I only have D2 as a monochrome cover. These are known as the monochrome covers. S1, Tomb of Horrors, I don't own that as a monochrome. But then also B1, so In Search of the Unknown. All these are published in 1978. So this is a crucial year because TSR starts to realize people will buy these things and they can kind of start controlling how these adventures are going to look and what should be included in adventure and that kind of thing. And they're cheaper to produce than hardback books or boxed sets. And, they probably had a bigger markup. So this is something that they're going to continue for a long time, publishing adventure modules. Now, the other thing that happens in 1978, there's a lot of things, but the other crucial thing, of course, is the publication of this, the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So you could argue that this being published is more important than the adventures, and I wouldn't quibble with that. So either or, they're both crucial in the history of the development of Dungeons and Dragons. But Advanced Dungeons and Dragons technically debuts a year earlier, 1977, with the Monstrum Manual, but there were no rules to play the game. So the rules were morphing, they were changing. You're going to want to see my video on the monster manual so that you understand what I'm talking about when I say the rules were morphing and changing. But it wasn't until 1978 and the publication of this book around June, I want to say it was, Player's Handbook, where you start to you don't start, you get the rules. You get the rules for playing Dungeons and Dragons advanced. So you have the character classes and the different races, and you have the spells and the weapons and the equipment and the how to generate a character, ability scores, and what those mean. All that stuff is in this particular book. And prior to this, again, if you wanted to use the Monster Manual for Advanced D&D, you had to use either the original D&D set or the Holmes Basic set. So 1978, critical year in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so now we're going to go to my next year, which is going to be 1997. I don't have any products to show for this particular year, but this is a crucial year in the history of Dungeons and Dragons because this is the year where TSR is going to be sold to Wizards of the Coast. And there was a lot of things going on at the company right now, which affected the game of Dungeons and Dragons. As an example, Dragon Magazine hadn't been published for 6 months. The last issue of Dragon Magazine that was published was issue number 236, I think it was, in December of 1996. So it's in 1997, in July, when the magazine starts back up with issue number 237. Published at this point now, still published by TSR, but TSR being owned by Wizards of the Coast. So that was critical because that's where you got your news back then. Like, you know, there were like message boards and stuff that were starting to become a thing. But before this, if you wanted news about what was happening in the gaming community, you read Dragon Magazine. And so it was a very important piece in helping people understand what was going on. And in fact, the introduction or the editor's note in the issue number 237 basically says, like, you know, where have we been? And they apologized and said, like, we had no idea that if that issue number 236 was going to be our last one for over 6 months. Like, it never occurred to them because, you know, that's how fast things were changing at the company. But the acquisition by Wizards of the Coast means that they were able to pay off their printers, pay off their debts, and get things being published again, start to publishing new products and putting them out there. So that is a crucial year in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. Without that purchase by Wizards of the Coast, who knows what would have happened to this game if it would have just completely stopped development. And, you know, other games would have become the premier role-playing game due to the mismanagement of the company at the time. So 1997, a critical year. So we're going to jump forward just 3 more years then to the year 2000 and the debut of this version of D&D. So this is going to be one of my years where I talk about Wizards of the Coast, but this is now published by Wizards of the Coast. So by this point, they've purchased TSR in 1997, and they were continuing to publish Dungeons and Dragons products with the TSR logo and trade dress. You know, it was revised, but it was still TSR. But now in 2000, they have dispensed with the TSR branding, and this is published, as you see here, by Wizards of the Coast. This is the 3rd edition Player's Handbook. You notice it doesn't say 3rd edition. It also doesn't say advanced. It just says Dungeons and Dragons. There's nothing on here to tell you what edition it is. So this was a big deal. This is the first time since basically you could say since 1977. So 23 years later, this is the first time where you're not going to have 2 concurrently published editions of Dungeons and Dragons running. So you no longer have the Dungeons and Dragons, or again, I keep mentioning this, as a kid, what we called was basic Dungeons and Dragons. And then you had advanced Dungeons and Dragons, 2 separate game systems being published concurrently with rules that were different. This dispenses with that and says, we're just going to have one game. We're going to call it Dungeons and Dragons. That's the name that's catchy. And we're going to continue forward with this. This is the first version of the game, really, that leans into one of Wizards of the Coast's core strengths, which was Magic the Gathering. So I don't mean that in terms of, you know, they didn't use Magic the Gathering like the, you know, the setting it took forever for them to do that, which I never understood. I would have thought one of the first things they would have published would have been a campaign setting for the Magic the Gathering setting, but that's neither here nor there. But they're drawing upon the business practices of Magic the Gathering, which was something that helped Wizards of the Coast become the company that it was, put them in a position to be so financially stable that they were able to acquire the Dungeons and Dragons brand and all of TSR's assets, at least most of them, and pay off all their debts and start publishing product, was because of Magic the Gathering. Also because they'd acquired the Pokemon license and that had a skinny minute where it was doing really, really well. So but Magic the Gathering, one of the key things about what makes that game so popular is this idea of customization of you're building your deck, right? So, and one of the ways that you do that is they're constantly putting out new cards. And as a player, you want to get those new cards. You do not want to be left behind. You want to make sure that you're keeping up to date and that the deck that you're using is constantly evolving and incorporating these new cards with like little combinations that you figure out. It's all math, but you're doing all these combinations to figure out the quickest and fastest way to get certain cards out of your hand into your play area, and then being able to use them to do what you want to do against your opponent faster than the opponent is doing their thing that they're trying to do against you, right? But it's that idea of wanting these new cards and going through hundreds of cards to pick out maybe 3 that you actually are going to use in your deck. Okay. So that's what this version of the game does very well, I guess you could say. It's something I really liked at the beginning, and I grew more disillusioned with it the longer I played. But the idea of customization, adding feats and class abilities and prestige classes and new properties for weapons or different spells. Spells have always been part of the game. But the idea of mixing and matching a spell with a feat, with a racial ability, with a level-based class ability, with a weapon property, all these different things, and figuring out, oh, okay, if all those things come together and I can do that, then my character is going to be unstoppable in this specific situation, this specific scenario. And then that means this game is shifting in how the game is played a little bit, at least to me. But it's shifting the power a little bit away from the dungeon master and putting it into the hands of the player, because then the player has all of these options that they are using. And you guys have heard me mention before, and I know a lot of old timers believe this, but I actually think more options means you have fewer options, but that's another argument for another time. But the idea that the players have all these options, and then it rests upon the dungeon master to then create the situation for the player to use the options that they picked. If the player picks, as an example, I'm just being very extreme here, but let's say the player picks a lot of feats and things that make them very good at underwater combat. Well, if the dungeon master never has you go in an underwater scenario, then all those feats and skills and things that you've picked are wasted. And as a player, you might get upset. So the implication is, the player's going to pick all these things, and then the dungeon master then has to make sure that they are including those situations in the game so that player can shine based on the choices that they made. So it does start to me to kind of shift it a little bit towards this idea. And then players might get upset if the dungeon master doesn't do that. The players, might say that the dungeon master's not being fair because they're not including these things. But that's a huge change in the game, and it impacts the way that people play the game today. So all the way in 5th edition, those types of combinations and character customization and player options, those still exist in 5th edition. Maybe not to the extreme that they did like in the 3.5 era, but they're still there. Okay, the other thing, probably the key thing that comes out in 2000, besides the new rule set and the change, and there were a lot of things changed in here. This is the first time in the publication of the game where they took these things that people considered sacred parts of Dungeons and Dragons and made decisions on whether or not they were going to keep those in the game. So this is the first one that changes from descending armor class, which has been part of the game since 1974, and changes it to ascending armor class. This is the first one that gets away with all the disparate systems of percentiles or X and 6 rolls or roll D20 roll under. It gets rid of all those and says every roll that you're going to make is going to be, aside from like damage usually, but for the most part, aside from damage and generating your ability scores, every roll you make is going to be a D20 roll high. add your bonus, compare it to a target number, and you want to beat the target number. So this changes all those different subsystems that existed. I have a whole video where I talk about the early subsystems of D&D and why they existed, what the point was of having all those different systems. But this gets rid of all that and just condenses it, consolidates it into a single role. It is the first one that makes the ability score, bonuses, and penalties exactly the same for every ability. So that kind of where you go down to like at 18 you're +4, and at 3 you're -4, and then everything in between is scheduled very specifically number by number. And before that wasn't the case. So your bonuses and penalties were different depending on which ability score you were talking about. And all that goes away in this. So that's this. Also, the open game license, the OGL, can't overstate how important that was to the development of the game of Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games in general. And the open game license comes from this third edition, from the folks at TSR, the people in charge, specifically Ryan Dancy, not TSR, Wizards of the Coast, but Ryan Dancy was the person who really championed the OGL and wanted to put it out there. I think a lot of you know what the OGL is, but the short version is it is a stripped down version of a license of the rules of this game that allow people to use the rules from this to publish other things that are compatible with this system. And that might seem very simple. A lot of people are going to argue you can't copyright rules. Yes, of course you can't copyright rules. However, TSR was very suit happy. They went after a ton of people and forced them to shut things down for breaking what they considered to be their copyright. And so this open game license made it easy because you knew that they weren't going to come after you because they published this and said, you can use everything in here. If something's not in here, you can't use it. A lot of people get tripped up on that. So that's usually product identity stuff. But the mechanics of the game and how the game worked became, it was ubiquitous in like the early 2000s, like that first like 5, 6, 7 years where so many people were publishing stuff that was compatible with this game. And, made it hard for other games to break through, but it also made it very, very easy for small independent publishers, single people with desktop publishing programs on a laptop to publish a supplement that would get eyes on it that otherwise never would have been seen, only because they were able to say that it was done under the OGL and it was compatible with third edition. So you couldn't mention that it was compatible with D&D, but there were some rules about whether you could say it was compatible with the D20 system. There was different licenses for a while, but that is a huge moment in the history of role-playing games, this idea of opening up the system and allowing people to publish things that were compatible with this game so that everybody knew that they wouldn't have to convert anything. It would be immediately compatible. Huge watershed moment in the history of Dungeons and Dragons and, like I said, gaming in general. And then lastly, I'm going to go to 2014. Another Wizards of the Coast. This is the 5th edition game that was published 2014 on the 40th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons. And I think it's pretty safe to say that this is, in terms of the sheer number of players that played this game at the same time, probably the most popular version of Dungeons and Dragons ever. It was 2014. This game comes out and there's a confluence of things that happen that help the game really get out of that sort of idea that the game is played by nerds in basements that don't have social lives. And 2014 is where you really start to see that because this game became so popular, people started talking about it more and it gets more in the public eye where people seem to have gotten past this idea of like these preconceived notions of what the game is. And it's part of pop culture now. So, Big Bang Theory and Stranger Things and Critical Role and, the Dungeons and Dragons movie, and there's Lego sets now. And, a lot of that all came later after this, but this was sort of the catalyst for a lot of those things where it became so popular. They also did unique things with this system, things like an open public beta test of this game, because 4th edition was very, very polarizing, the one that came between this and this. It was so polarizing that they wanted to not make that mistake again. So they pulled in people, designers that were popular, say, in the old school movement and brought them in to help consult on this version of the game. And they play tested a lot of stuff, like I said, publicly. They would put out a thing like, here's a new class, tell us what you think of this. And people would comment, and those comments helped shape the way that this game took place. So you might not like this game, but they did a lot, or this version of the game, but they did do a lot of work to try to understand what people wanted and to try to go back a little bit to the roots that they'd gotten away from, especially in fourth edition, but even late in the 3.5 era. So that's 2014 with fifth edition. And that's going to wrap up my honorable mention list. And now we're going to dig into my top 5 lists. And again, this top 5 list is now going to sort of be in my order of importance leading up to the most important. Okay, I hope you enjoyed my honorable mentions. Again, let me know in the comments below what you think of those and whether I should have bumped any of them up to my most important crucial years in the development history of Dungeons & Dragons. But let's get into my list. So again, I'm going, these are my top 5 leading up to the most important critical year. And we're going to start off with 1989, a number, another summer, sound of a funky drummer. This is the release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. Super critical, super crucial in the history of Dungeons & Dragons. So this is going to be the first version of the game that is written, created, developed, and published without any kind of oversight whatsoever by Gary Gygax, one of the 2 co-creators of the game. So that's a huge deal. That this game, now you had versions of the game published before that weren't written by Gary. You had Holmes Basic, you obviously had Moldvay Cook Marsh, you had Menser Basic, but all of those were done while Gary was working at the company. So he was involved in those. We know that he made changes to the Holmes Basic set. I just talked all about that in a video somewhat recently on the history of the Holmes Basic set. So he was involved in those. We also know that Gary was working on a 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. He wrote articles in Dragon Magazine where he talked about there was going to be a new edition coming out and that he was making he had some ideas. He talked about the people that he was going to work with on that, none of whom were the people that ended up working on this, by the way. And he talked about some of the ideas and the concepts that he was going to include, such as some new character classes, which are really interesting, and none of those really end up appearing in here. So he had his ideas. Again, I have a video on what Gary Gygax said he was planning for 2nd edition, so you can see that if you want to see how different what we got is from what he was proposing. And I dive a little bit into what is actually in this book. But 2nd edition is, again, a key moment. It's also the first time where you see a numbering of the editions. This is the first time where you have this idea that we're going to start numbering the editions of the game. So what's interesting is when you get to like 3rd, 4th, and 5th editions, the rule books don't actually say the edition number on the rule books. Only the 3.5 ones do. So those are really interesting. That the revision to 3rd edition that comes out 3 years after, so that comes out in 2003, actually says version 3.5 on the covers, so that you could help distinguish between that and the original 3rd edition. But like 3rd, 4th, and 5th, they don't say that. Everybody calls it that. They're colloquially known as those, but the rule books themselves just say Dungeons and Dragons. So, but this one very specifically points out that this is 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So this makes a lot of changes to the game where it starts to, they had kind of started this already, but this edition specifically is where you start seeing that they are, I don't want to say catering to a certain class of people, but they are really shifting into this idea that this is a family-friendly kind of game, so that people shouldn't be afraid of it. People shouldn't be scared like that satanic panic stuff. And again, I have a whole video about that as well and what was going on at the time and how D&D got wrapped up in that. But this idea that this is going to be a little bit, like I said, more friendly. There's nothing in here that like someone could look at and object to being in here. James Ward, who was at TSR at the time and was one of the top ranked people, had this sort of umbrella overview that they didn't want to put anything in here that someone would call and be offended by, where they'd get letters about it, like that people would complain about. So they really were trying to shift. And so that's where you have things like the removal of assassins from this book. Now, the the party line was that, well, anybody who kills for money is an assassin. You don't need a class for that. Okay, sure, but the real reason was because assassins and killing people is murder. That's evil, and they didn't want to put that in the game. You have the removal of half orcs from this game as well, from this version of the game. You have the removal of all demons and devils. Any of that kind of stuff comes out of the game, and they'd been part of it since not quite the very beginning, but very, very close. And so you have the removal of all of those, and then later on, they're going to reincorporate them, but they don't call them demons and devils. So you have all those changes being made, but you also have, mechanical changes. You have monks coming out of this because they said, oh, the monk really belongs more in that kind of like Eastern milieu kind of aesthetic. And so we're going to remove them from the core game and let you keep them in games that have that sort of Eastern flavor to them, like faux Asian flavor, I guess, if you will. And then, you, like I said, you have the removal of half orcs. You have the introduction of the Bard as a standalone class. That was one of the few ideas that Gary said he was going to do. He mentioned that he was going to take the Bard from being this, technically you could think of it as like one of the original prestige classes, or it was sort of like a dual class, except from Advanced D&D, except it was not dual. It was a triple class. Where you had to start out as a fighter, then become a thief, and then become a druid. And once you became a druid, you were then now considered a bard. And that he was going to do away with that and make the bard a standalone class. And this is the book that introduces that to official D&D. The bard had been a standalone class originally in Strategic Review, which is the one that Gary actually kind of used as inspiration for creating his class. He just changed it from being standalone. You have non-weapon proficiencies in here. And I want to say is a core part of the game. However, it says that is optional. But it's really not. Everything that's published for it says here it's optional. Everything that's published for this version of the game going forward, all the supplemental books, all that kind of stuff, they all build upon this idea that you're using the non-weapon proficiencies that are in here. So that becomes a core part of the game. And again, it's really just kind of this shift toward, using skills that's putting a little bit more power in the hands of the players, because it's specifically telling you these are the things that your character can do. And it's outlining like very specifically and mechanically what those things are, as opposed to leaving it up to DMs to adjudicate and come up with a ruling on the fly based on what the player says that they want their character to do. Now, another thing that you have published in 1989 that goes along with this is the Complete Fighter's Handbook. This is the first of what's going to become a series of 15 different complete handbooks for different character classes. So you're going to get one for all of the 9 character classes that are in this book. And then you're also going to get additional ones for classes that aren't in this book, like ninjas and barbarians and things like that. So but this is the start. Before this book in 1989, you did not have character guides. You didn't have a whole book dedicated on just things that a fighter could do or just things that a thief could do, all that kind of stuff. And this is the start. It's right here. And so you're starting to see the seeds being planted of getting to that 3rd edition that I was talking about just a little bit ago, where you start having all these options for players. It is solidified in 3rd edition, and it becomes a core part of the game. These were all, of course, considered optional, but most people bought these books. You might not have used them, but you at least checked them out. But these books, you've got all your things on creating characters and using armor, and you've got your character kits. I've talked all about those before. Role-playing ideas, combat rules, though, that's a huge part of this. All these maneuvers and things that fighters can do. And then all this new equipment and things like that. So this kicks off this idea of books that are dedicated for players to buy, as opposed to just dungeon masters. That a key failing not failing, but part of the difficulty with the game of Dungeons and Dragons is that most of the things that you're going to create for the game for sale that can be sold originally were focused on dungeon masters. So monster manuals, adventures, supplements for creating your own dungeons, all that kind of stuff is all focused on a very small percentage of your entire audience, because a player is not going to buy an adventure because they're going to play through it. They're not going to buy the monster manual necessarily because they don't need to know that. Now, a lot of players would buy the monster manual because they want to read it and memorize all the things so that they could beat the monster when they came across it. But the intent was that was for a monster man or a dungeon master to use to stock the dungeon that they were creating for their players. So you have all of these products that are focused on a very small audience, and so the sales of those was always going to be artificially more limited than they would have wanted. But when you have a book like this that's focused on players that have fighter characters, and then you have one for each character class, and many players have more than one character, you would want to have these. And then also the dungeon masters would need to have these because they need to know what the players have access to. And also using this to help build the NPCs that the players were going to interact with in the game. So this is a start of a lot of people say, second edition starts to do like class bloat, and it really does because of these books. And that's something that's continued on into third edition. But these were rife in second edition and in third edition. I mean, you just couldn't get away from them because they knew that people were going to buy them. They were huge sellers. So this is a start. It's a key moment in the history of the game that affected the game going, for the next, more than a decade, beyond almost 2 decades from 1989 through, around 2008 when fourth edition came out, and they kind of got away from those class guides, right? So that's a long period of time for this to sort of be driving the idea of like what people were going to buy. What are the things that people really want? Okay, you also have in 1989, the start of what is going to become a trend in second edition Dungeons and Dragons, which is kicking off this idea of multiple different settings. So you have the release of the Spelljammer setting in 1989, and this was a huge moment. It's this intermixture of fantasy and science fiction going back to the early days of the hobby, and kind of being inspired by the inspirational texts that the creators of the game read when they did that. So the John Carter of Mars stuff, the Dying Earth stuff, all those things were this blend of science fiction and fantasy, or science fantasy. I talk a little bit about that in my video on science fiction and fantasy in Dungeons and Dragons. And the Spelljammer setting was kind of a way of bringing some of those things back that we'd gotten away from. The Dragonlance, Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, none of those really have those science fiction elements to them. And so Spelljammer as a setting was a way to bring that back into the game. And also, though, it is, I'd call it a niche setting. So it's a very specific aesthetic. A lot of people don't want that kind of thing in their game. So I don't know that it had the broad base appeal that something like a Forgotten Realms or a Dragonlance had. And also, but it was the start of, again, this idea of publishing different campaign settings that started to have smaller and smaller audiences, and it started to fracture the player base because you had players that became loyal to a setting as opposed to the game, as opposed to the system. They became loyal to a setting. And so, you had, not only Spelljammer, but then you're going to have Ravenloft and all these other different settings, Birthright, all these different things that come out in the late mid to late second edition era that start to get smaller and smaller player bases because people weren't buying all of them. Like if you were playing Spelljammer, you didn't really have a reason to buy one of the other new settings that came out. Okay, so but that's a key moment because those settings, and Spelljammer being the first one, start to indicate the direction that second edition was going in terms of trying to come up with product that they thought people were going to want to buy. So that is my look at second edition, my number 5 of my most critical years in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so let's move on to the next year in my list here. And this is going to be the year 1977. So I will tell you, I mentioned originally, I kept going back and forth. Originally, I had this as the most important year, like my number 1. And as I went through everything and I kept looking at my notes, and I had, my bullet point notes in my notebook over here, I kept changing it every time that I went over it. Like I thought about my list, and ultimately I put this as in my number 4 slot. But so that tells you, at least to me, how important I think all of these top 5 are. Okay, but 1977 is going to see the release of the Monster Manual for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Again, I just did a whole video on the Monster Manual, but this is important for a lot of reasons. First off, it's the first hardback book published for a role-playing game ever. It's this book. So before this, you have the 1974 box set, and that set sort of set the standard that a lot of people were following, that small digest size. Like even 3 years later in 1977, when this book comes out, you have Game Designers Workshop put out Traveler in a digest size box with 3 booklets, just like original D&D. That's how influential that design was. But TSR wasn't content to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. They also had more content to fit in that size of a book. They had some larger size, like regular size paper books that had been published in soft cover, but this is going to be the first one as a hardback. It's the debut of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons system. Now that's a little bit wonky as we've talked before, because there was no system yet. So this is a book of monsters. There's no system to use it with when it's released. So you have to use it with either the Holmes Basic set or the original D&D set. But this starts to set the stage, however, for what books are going to be included in each subsequent edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or Dungeons and Dragons in general. After this, you're always going to have a monster manual, with the exception of second edition. So that's the only one that doesn't have a monster manual. It has a monstrous compendium, which was a 3-ring binder. And the idea was that each monster was just on a single page, or maybe it was a front and back page. But they were made with, 3-hole punch paper, so that as new books were released, you could alphabetize them yourself by opening your book and moving the pages around to alphabetize. It didn't always work, because some of the monsters were only on a single page. You might end up with a monster on the front page, on the back is another monster, but in between those two, there should have been another one, but you can't put it in between because they're front and back. So the alphabetizing didn't really work the way that they intended. It was close, but the other problem is, anybody knows who's used 3-ring binders and notebook paper like that, the paper's inevitably going to rip out. It's always going to happen. So unless you get those really wonky, like little ring protector things, for like notebook protectors to put on the holes, and even those sometimes give out as you continue opening the rings over and over and over again in your book, like the actual contraption. Sometimes the springs wear out or whatever it is, and then it won't close anymore. So interesting idea, but there's a reason that didn't stick around. So a few years later, they're going to consolidate that monstrous compendium into a book called the Monstrous Manual, which is the one I have. I've showed it here on the channel before. Probably my favorite monster book in any edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And then starting in 3rd edition and onward, you're going to have, again, the Monster Manual, and it all goes back to this book in 1977. So the impact that this had with the idea of, we're going to have a Monster Manual, we're also going to have a Player's Handbook and a Dungeon Master's Guide, and we're going to publish them in 3 hardback books. That becomes the standard that we're still using here in 2025. Okay, so this is also the book that starts to incorporate things that go beyond just folklore and mythology. Now, you'd seen these debuting disparately in either supplements or in articles in Strategic Review or Dragon Magazine, but this is going to put it all together in here. So you have these iconic monsters that maybe before you didn't have access to because you didn't have those supplements, or you didn't subscribe to Strategic Review or Dragon Magazine, you hadn't seen those, but you're going to get it all here. And this starts to help define what Dungeons and Dragons, sort of, like I said, aesthetic, what its culture is, by the types of monsters that they include, that they made up in here. Owlbears and beholders and ropers and purple worms and all that kind of stuff, part of this game. And it starts to help to define the culture of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, but 1977 has a lot else going on as well. You also have the release of the Holmes Basic set, 1977. Again, this is just the rule book. This was part of a box set originally. And so this is where you start to realize that TSR was beginning to understand that that game that they had published, that original 3-book little box set, was not necessarily very good at helping teach people how to play the game. And so they were approached by Professor Holmes, Holmes, and from California, close by to where I live. And he approached TSR and said, I would like to take a stab at rewriting the rules to make it easy for younger people and newer people, especially key players who aren't familiar with war games, teaching them how to play this game. And he offered to do it for free, and TSR took him up on that. And so then you have the publication of this version of the game. Definitely check out my video where I talk about what is different in this versus what came before, and as well as what's the same, but talking about that. But this idea that you have this introduction version of the game. However, the editors at TSR or somebody there, it could be Gary Gygax, it could be a lot of different people. What they do is, because Gary realizes that he's coming out with this, he's writing this advanced D&D system, which again doesn't exist when this is being published. But later on, they go back and they change the manuscript in this to mention that if you want to play in this game beyond third level, because this only covers levels 1 through 3, you have to refer to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Whereas originally this was not written as an introduction to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's very clearly written to be an introduction to original Dungeons and Dragons, the 1974 edition. So there's some weirdness going on with these books, but this is the start where you're going to start to see two separate concurrent published editions of Dungeons and Dragons happening at the same time, because there are things in this rules wise that are not going to be consistent and compatible with the rules that come out in the 1978 Player's Handbook. Okay, so that at that point you then have two different versions. Technically you have three, because you also have original Dungeons and Dragons, which has differences from Holmes. So all of those are different, and they're all being published at the same time. So this idea that they were coming out with new things, they wanted to capture new players, they want to understand how to get a hold of new people and bring them into the game. This idea of a basic set that covers levels 1 through 3 is going to exist in Dungeons and Dragons for the next almost 20 years. Okay, this idea of having this basic set. And it's also the impetus and the sort of the inspiration for what they have now, like the starter sets or the beginners sets for even 5th edition. So all of those go back to this idea of, we need a way to help quickly teach people who don't know how to play this game, who've never played it before, how to play and advance their characters through the first 2 levels, so that we can capture them, get them into the infrastructure of the game, and then move them on to purchasing the other rule books and things like that. That all starts with this right here, 1977. You also have in 1977 the release of the first play aids for Dungeons and Dragons, the first things that TSR thought you would need to help you run your game beyond just the rules and the expansions to the rules that they were publishing. So you have 2 different ones. Now, this is a much later printing, but you have the Monster and Treasure Assortment, 1978, and originally they were broken up into 3 publications. So you had levels 1 through 3, levels 4 through 6, and levels 7 through 9. This is mine. That's a combination of levels 1 through 9. But the idea is you used this to stock your dungeon. So there are tables in here, and as you're making your dungeon, depending on what level of the dungeon that you're on, the deeper you go, the more difficult it becomes. Very similar to video games, right? Which is where the video game idea comes from. It comes from Dungeons and Dragons, in case people out there weren't aware of that. So the farther you progress, the more difficult it becomes. And these have tables of the monsters that you might encounter on those different levels by terrain type, environment, and then also what kind of treasure that you would roll up. So you didn't, as a dungeon master in the original days, you weren't just willy-nilly opening up the book and picking and going, oh, that monster looks cool, I'll put that here. And I want them to find a +5 Holy Avenger, I'll put that in. You were rolling on tables. This was keeping it based in numbers and statistics and things, so that you didn't accidentally put something in there that your character was either too easy for your characters or too hard. And also you weren't giving the store away with your treasure. You were keeping it limited based on the types of encounters that they were having at that level, what was reasonable for them to get as the treasure. Now, a lot of people didn't ever use these kinds of things. They ignored that. And that's where you get the term like the Monty Hall dungeon, where players walked in and then they with nothing, and they walk out with, like I said, +5 Holy Avengers and, sometimes even more crazy kinds of things. The other one that you had as the play aid in 1978 was the Dungeon Geomorphs. So these were tables and designs that you use that you rolled on to help you design your dungeon. That would help you shape which which way the tunnel was going to go and where the doors were going to be and secret doors and all this kind of stuff. These dungeon geomorphs to help you map out a dungeon ahead of time. And they were also kind of broken by level, again, because the different dungeon levels had different kinds of things in them. So those are the first things. Now, I have a whole video where I talk about the first play aids of Dungeons and Dragons. That is, again, a critical year in the development and the history of Dungeons and Dragons. So hopefully you get the understanding of why this year is so important, why I almost picked it as being my top #1 year. But we're going to get into those ones later, and you'll see, you'll end up seeing why I picked the ones that I picked. Okay, zipping right along here. We're going to go to my next year in my most critical, crucial, pivotal, whatever you want to say, years in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. That's going to be 1975. Bunch of things going on this year. And I'm going to start, however, with these two things. So I guess I'll just pile these a little differently. These are the first two supplements for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I have entire videos dedicated separately to each one of these, one for Greyhawk and one for Blackmoor. These are the first supplements to Dungeons and Dragons, but they also, and very specifically Greyhawk, these are what are responsible for changing the game from how it was in original Dungeons and Dragons and making it so much closer to the way that we play and look at the game today. So again, I have gone over this a few times, but if you're new to the channel and you haven't seen those yet, Greyhawk is where you get the Thief class, or which you now call the Rogue, comes from Greyhawk. Paladins come from Greyhawk. Half-Elves debut in Greyhawk. The idea that different character classes would have different hit dice comes from Greyhawk. Before that, every class had D6 hit dice. The idea that different weapons do different kinds of damage comes from Greyhawk. Before that, every weapon did dice 6 damage. Okay, so the idea that monsters might do different types of damage and have different hit dice comes from Greyhawk. So all of those things, and those are core parts of the game. The idea that your ability scores will affect more than just how much experience you earn. That starts to be uncovered here in Greyhawk. You had that a tiny bit in original D&D because you did have Constitution affecting your hit points. And I think you had Wisdom maybe was affecting how you're like saving throws versus certain kinds of saves, like magical saves, although that might have been in here. But the idea that like your ability scores did more, again, than just impact how much experience you gained and whether you got a bonus or a penalty to your experience point based on that those ability scores. So you can learn more about that on my video on ability scores if you want to check that out. But these two supplements, the first adventure published is in Blackmoor. So I talked about the first published standalone adventure. That's 1978, Studying the Hill Giant Chief. However, the first published adventure total is part of this book, Blackmoor. It's Temple of the Frog that's buried in here. So that is, again, starting to lay out how an adventure should be written and the kinds of things that you should include in that adventure so that a dungeon master can run it for their players. Okay, that comes from this. Monks come from Blackmoor. Assassins come from Blackmoor. The Sahuagin and underwater combat and adventure and all that stuff comes from Blackmoor. So there's a lot of stuff in these two books that really define and change the way that we play Dungeons and Dragons and affects the way that we play it today. Without these two supplements, and again, very specifically without Greyhawk, the game would be very, very different. Okay. Also, the idea, just in general, that we can expand the rules. We're not changing them. We're not rewriting them. We're not revising them. We're expanding them. We're adding things to the rules that you can use. New character classes, new races, new weapons, new spells, all these things. And again, it seems second nature to us now, but that was not something that was done for games before these. For the most part, it wasn't an acceptable or an accepted thing that you were going to do that. But now pretty much every role-playing game is written with the intent that there will be supplemental materials that come out that help expand the options that they've presented in their core rule books. And these are the two books specifically in 1975 that make that a thing within the role-playing game community, that games, role-playing games specifically, were going to continually expand and offer new options. Starts here. You also have things going on like the debut of the Dungeon board game by Dave McGarry. So that was Dave McGarry wrote Dungeon specifically as like a board game version of the Blackmore games that he was playing with Dave Arneson. That's kind of where Dungeon came from originally. And so this idea that you could use Dungeon as a way to bring people into this fantasy idea, it has a lot of the same character types, character roles that you can play in Dungeon, and this idea of you're exploring a dungeon to be, fight monsters and take their treasure is in Dungeon. So it is D&D encapsulated as a very friendly, easy to use and understand board game, and so that almost kind of serves as an entry-level game or an introduction to Dungeons and Dragons before the release of that Holmes Basics set that I mentioned here earlier. You have the board game Dungeon kind of helping serve that role. Also, from a business standpoint, in 1975, you have the dissolving of Tactical Studies Rules, the original company that published Dungeons and Dragons, and you have the creation of a brand new company, TSR Hobbies, Inc. So a lot of people have asked before, isn't Tactical Studies Rules and TSR the same thing because TSR is just the initials of Tactical Studies Rules? They're not. They're two separate companies. The company was originally called Tactical Studies Rules, and that name came from the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. And so Tactical Studies Rules came from that, okay? And that company was founded by Gary Gygax and Don Kay, and they just didn't have enough money to publish the game that they wanted. And so they brought in their third partner, Brian Bloom, who contributed money, and they were able to publish Dungeons and Dragons after also publishing a game called Cavaliers and Roundheads that they were hoping would help fund Dungeons and Dragons. It didn't sell that well. So, but then Don Kay passed away, and long story, and I have talked about this before, but eventually, his wife had his shares, but she didn't necessarily want to be involved in the company. So Brian Bloom's father, Melvin, came in, bought out her shares, and they created a brand new company. They had to dissolve Tactical Studies Rules, and they had to create a brand new company called TSR Hobbies. Now, they took the initials TSR from Tactical Studies Rules, but it is a separate entity. It could have been called anything. That's why in my early videos, I used to distinguish when I talked about Tactical Studies Rules versus TSR, because again, they're two separate things. But that's 1975. And again, the importance of these supplements in driving the future of the game can't be overstated. So, not that many products coming out this particular year. But again, the impact of these products that were there that have repercussions decades later was so very important. So with that, let's move on to talking about my next year. And this is, again, going to be a really key, important year. And I almost picked it as my number one, and you're going to see why in a second. But that is 1983. So much going on in that year. I'm just going to pile a bunch of stuff here. So 1983 is going to see the debut of a bunch of things. So the first off that we're going to have is the Monster Manual 2. Now, as far as monster books and the impact of the creatures that are in here on the future of the game, that's a little bit less so, but this is the first advanced D&D hardback that has been published at this point for over 2 years. So you had the Fiend Folio in 1981, and then there was a 2-year gap where you did not have any new advanced Dungeons and Dragons book coming out. And before that, you had a book every year. You had 77 Monster Manual, 78 Player's Handbook, 79 Dungeon Master's Guide, 80 you had DDs and Demigods, 81 you have Fiend Folio, and then you have nothing until this book comes out in 1983. So that alone was a big deal, the fact that this book was coming out at all. Mostly creatures that were debuted in different adventures, different modules, most specifically in S4 Lost Caverns of Sojkanth. But you have a few in here that are going to have some legacy to them, some new demons and devils and things like that. And so that you've got dinosaurs, I guess, whatever. But like I said, mostly it's things that had been previously published in different modules. However, you'll notice that this is an orange spine book. So 1983 sees a complete overhaul in the hardbacks for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that had been published. So you have this new logo here, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and you have this cover art. This is by Jeff Easley, who's going to do the cover art for every Advanced Dungeons and Dragons book coming out from this point on, as well as redoing all the covers for the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then they're going to rename deities and demigods to Legends and Lore. And again, that's part of that shift in awareness from the management of TSR that calling something deities and demigods might be off-putting to some people. Again, with this whole satanic panic thing going on, you can't overstate how much that affected decisions at the company moving forward. So changing it to Legends and Lore is a little bit, there's really nothing you can argue about with that, calling it Legends and Lore with brand new cover art. So the only book that is not going to get a revised orange spine, they call this the Orange Spine series, and revised cover art by Jeff Easley, is the Fiend Folio, for various different reasons. But, a lot of people, there's been fan art that's been done of like, well, what would the Fiend Folio have looked like with Jeff Easley art and the orange spine? And it actually looks pretty cool, I think. So, but it didn't get an official release. But this was a shift. Again, this is a marketing tactic as well, having all of the art done by the same artist, a very popular artist at the time. He's one of kind of like, for this era of time, one of what they call the Big Four, the Four Horsemen, which was him, Larry Elmore, Clyde Caldwell, and Keith Parkinson. You have Jeff Easley doing this cover art, and it gives every book the same kind of look and feel, where you could immediately identify on the shelves that this was part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's starting to be less like, the Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, and Dungeon Master's Guides, the original covers. Those are the ones that I started with, and the ones that I really respond to, especially that Player's Handbook cover. I love that Trampier Dave Player's Handbook cover. But the trade dress was different. The logos were different. The typefaces were different. The art all by different artists and of very, very different art styles. They didn't necessarily look cohesive. The only thing that brought them together was that little orange or yellow band in the corner that said Advanced D&D. But without that, you wouldn't necessarily look at those three books and think that they were supposed to work together. So this was an attempt to put everything in a similar trade dress and show the world that like TSR was taking another leap by revising the look of their stuff to like have this very slick produced work with very, very good art. I mean, I love the Jeff Easley art that's on these covers. I just have nostalgia for the original covers. So that's 1983. A lot of other things happening in 1983. Okay, so let's move on to talk about the release of this version of the game. Now, I only have the Dungeon Master rulebook, but this is part of the 1983 revised basic set with cover art by Larry Elmore. This is an iconic image. It's one that many people started with, 1983 box set called the Red Box. And it's from edited by Frank Metzner. So this is a revision of the 1981 Moldvay Cook Marsh basic set. That's the one I started with, that kind of magenta colored box with the Errol Otis cover. So only 2 years later, they revised it again. And I love my Moldvay Basic, and I love the Errol Otis artwork as well. But this particular image on this box set is one of the most iconic images in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. And the release of this game, like so many people came into Dungeons and Dragons that are still players today, came in with this version, with this basic set that was released in 1983, more so even than Moldvay, more so than Holmes, more so than the original. This is really one of the sets that really captured a lot of attention and a lot of new players. And I meet so many players on social media who tell me that this is the one that they started with. So, not one that I started with, which is why I only have this rule book. This was something a friend was just getting rid of a lot of stuff, and he didn't have, for whatever reason, didn't have the player book for this, but he had the Dungeon Master book. So that's 1983, the release of the set. Now, this is going to be the first set in a history of 5 box sets that are going to come out over the next few years. That is going to be known as the BECME version of D&D. That's Basic, Expert, Companion, Masters, and Immortals. So I think Immortals is going to come out in 86. So it's over like a 3-year time span where these box sets are coming out. It's going to be collected again into the version of the game known as BECME. So it's going to take you from levels 1 through 36, and then after level 36, your character can become an immortal, which is sort of like the basic D&D, non-advanced D&D version of gods, like in that kind of setting. So that's the BECME set. So very, very influential on the history of the game. And this is the set that is going to be, this is sort of like the end of changes for the basic set. So you have the Holmes basic set, you had Moldvay Cookmarsh basic, and then you have Menser basic. But once you hit Menser basic, that is the system, 83 through roughly, I forget when the last supplement came out, but it is supported and played all the way up until 3rd edition when they get rid of both concurrent editions of D&D. But this is going to create eventually the Rules Cyclopedia 1991, which is for a lot of people their favorite version of D&D. A lot of people refer to it as their desert island version of Dungeons and Dragons. The Rules Cyclopedia basically takes the BECM of BECME, so it just eliminates the Immortals part and puts it all into one rule book. Character creation, classes, races, monsters, treasures, spells, DM advice, campaign setting up, all that kind of stuff, all of that in one hardback rule book. And again, for a lot of people, that's their version of D&D because it's everything you need to play in one book. You don't need a bunch of box sets or a bunch of different rule books. It's also going to create the black, what people call the black box, which is the easy to master version of D&D. Also comes out in 1981 that covers, I believe, levels 1 through 5. I think it is. It might be 3, but I think it's 5. So if you ever hear people say they start with the black box, that's just a revision of this version of the game. But rules-wise, mechanics-wise, it's the same. And then you have the release of the classic D&D system. I think that's 1995. And classic D&D is just a repackaging of the basic line of D&D. So again, mechanically, they're not making any changes. So again, very influential in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. Also in 1983, you have the release of the World of Greyhawk campaign setting. Now, Greyhawk had already come out in 1980 as in what's called the Folio edition. But 1983 is going to see the release of this box set with these different books in here. You have your Guide to the World of Greyhawk, the Catalog of the Lands of the Flyness, being the eastern portion of the continent Oiric of Oith. So I've heard me say before, I always pronounced this Oerth when I was a kid, and then I read that Gary said it was supposed to be pronounced Oith, like you're from Brooklyn or you're Bugs Bunny or something like that. And I can never get over that because it's so, for me, it kind of takes me out of the moment. Calling it that makes me realize that it's not a fantasy, like it's a fantasy setting, but it pulls you out of the immersion, to me at least. But that's how Gary pronounced it. So I think that's interesting. And then you have the glossography here, put the breakdown of all the different nations and all that, and the counter tables and all this kind of stuff, and the different rulers, weather conditions, all that kind of stuff. And then these gorgeous maps by Darlene. I've showed these before. I have a whole video on this box set that I dive into this and the other iterations of the World of Greyhawk. The maps are just way too big to fit on here, but I love them. These are probably my favorite D&D maps of all time, more so than any others. So now why this is influential is because this is the first box set presentation of a campaign setting, at least published by TSR. And this is going to, again, set the stage for how campaign settings are going to be presented by the brand going forward. So there's going to be a box set a few years later for Forgotten Realms. I think that comes out in 1987, if memory serves. You're eventually going to get a box set for parts of the lands of Dragonlance. Spelljammer, that I talked about earlier in 1989, was a box set. You're going to have a box set for Ravenloft. You're going to have a box set for Birthright. You're going to have a box set for Dark Sun. Just all these different settings, and they're all going to be in boxed sets. And the first one was this. So again, setting the stage for what is to become a standard offering from TSR during this time period. So then impacting Dungeons and Dragons and the way we think of how things should be presented. Okay. Also, 1983, big year. This is again another one where I almost put this as my number one. Almost put this as my number one year. But it edged out by something else that you're going to see in a second. But the release of I6 Ravenloft by Tracy and Laura Hickman. So the impact of this adventure cannot, again, be overstated. I know I keep saying that, but it's true. This was so different. You have these isometric maps that you'd never really seen that in a TSR product before. And they were so popular, those types of maps. You have this idea of this story involving this villain, this Ravenloft, and why he's doing what he was doing. Whereas before, you didn't really have that. Before, you were just going into the dungeon and you were killing the monsters and taking their treasure. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't quibble about that at all. But this is sort of the beginning. This is before Dragonlance has come out, but it's going to be created by the same people who created Dragonlance. So this idea of having a story, a reason for why the player characters are doing what they're doing, other than just gaining treasure so that they can go up in level and become, heroes, right? This is assuming that there's this everything's happening for a reason, and then having all the different areas of like visiting the village and the fortune teller and the whole mechanic of the cards that she flips over, so that the adventure changes every time based on which cards are pulled up and how you read those cards. And then like the villagers and this whole gothic kind of setting. You hadn't seen that in a D&D game before. And then you've got this gorgeous artwork here by Clyde Caldwell, very obviously reminiscent of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but you hadn't seen that kind of horror aspect to the most part, like that gothic horror. You hadn't seen that in a D&D official product before. So this is the start of that. And this is then in turn going to inspire the creation of an entire campaign setting, the Realms of Terror, Ravenloft, that's going to come out in the second edition era. Okay. And that is still used today. So there was just recently, I think it was in 2024, it might have been late 2023, there was a 5th edition Ravenloft supplement that came out. That's how much impact this single individual adventure had. The fact that decades later, they're still using this as inspiration for new supplements and settings and adventures in the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons. All the way, like I said, decades later. Okay, so I'm of no doubt that we will see future releases of Ravenloft. It might not be for a few years, but eventually it will come back. It's very, very popular, and popular with a certain group of people who grew up with this being their default horror setting was Ravenloft. So hugely inspirational. And again, that all goes back to 1983. Now, what else is going on in 1983? I told you this is a giant year. Well, you have the diversification of TSR. So it's going to break into a bunch of individual business entities. And as opposed to just TSR Hobbies Inc., it's going to diverge into, I think, 4 different ones. So there was one for overseas, like foreign, outside of the US. You had the main TSR Hobbies that was in the US. And then you had one that was more involved in like entertainment. That's going to be Dungeons and Dragons entertainment group that Gary Gygax is going to end up running. And then you had a 4th group, and I forget what that one was about, maybe new product development, but like diversification outside of just role-playing games. And that is going to lead us to other things that happen in 1983. This is the infamous year, or I should say it's the year where you get the infamous TSR involvement in that needlecraft, that needlework company. There's a whole list of reasons of why that happened, but essentially it boils down to nepotism. But TSR invested in a company that produced needlework patterns and they started trying to create needlework patterns of D&D things. And those two, I think the Venn diagram overlap of those two hobbies is almost non-existent, but for whatever reason, they invested in that company and tried to make it work. But you also had the creation of miniatures manufacturing by TSR before they had been licensing out to other companies. Now they were trying to make their own miniatures. It's not going to last very long, but they're going to try to do that. And they have a whole toys and gifts thing that they're doing separate. So they're trying to diversify and make their company not just reliant on their core strength role-playing games. Probably not a great idea, but they were trying things. That's 1983. You have, again, I mentioned the D&D Entertainment Group. Now, that group was originally TSR Entertainment. It's later going to be changed names to D&D Entertainment. But the original idea of that group, that division of TSR, was to get a movie made. They wanted a Dungeons and Dragons movie. I've talked about this before. Gary Gygax talks about it a lot in articles in Dragon Magazine, and implies in the early 80s that a movie script is in development and it should come out within the next year or two. That never surfaces while Gary is still with the company. The first D&D movie is not going to come out until I think 2000, and it was a disaster if you've ever seen that. But the one thing that you do get, however, from D&D Entertainment in 1983 is the D&D cartoon. So this is my DVD box set that some friends gave me. And the D&D cartoon was, again, hugely influential. Aired on Saturday mornings during a time period when, there were no cable networks dedicated to children's programming. So if you wanted to watch cartoons as a kid in 1983, you watched them on Saturday morning. You might be lucky to have a channel, an independent station that ran cartoons from syndicated cartoons after school. That's where I saw most of my Looney Tunes cartoons, was after school Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry. But a lot of people didn't have that. So if you wanted new cartoons, especially, you watched on Saturday morning, and all three of the major networks, which at the time was just ABC, CBS, and NBC, had children's cartoon programming in the early 80s. And the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon debuting in 1983, it's going to run for 2 years, and it's going to lead its time slot for those 2 years, spawn 100 different licenses coming out of this game or this cartoon. And it also helps put D&D more into the public perception of what this game is, and start to help file off all these worries about the satanic panic when people see what's actually going on. And the idea that this would be on a major network, on network programming for kids, and the FCC and all these people were saying, yep, this is okay. Like, we don't have a problem with this. People started to realize that, like, maybe some of the satanic panic and all these fears that they had about the game were misguided and misplaced and not really something that they needed to be worrying about. And all of that comes from this D&D cartoon. So still influential. Again, decades later, there was a car commercial. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen it. It's a live action car commercial. I just forgot the car brand off the top of my head. I'll put a screen cap up here so you can see it. And it was produced, I want to say Brazil. I could be wrong on that, somewhere in South America, but I'm pretty sure it was Brazil. But they made a whole car commercial featuring the characters from this cartoon in live action form. And it was amazing. That they did that, and they thought that there was enough nostalgia for this cartoon to make a car commercial more than 20 years later, 25 years later, let's say, from the cartoon coming out, that was going to resonate with people, that people would respond to and be like, oh yeah, I remember that cartoon. Like, that's cool. I want to buy this car now. That is a huge legacy of Dungeons and Dragons in that cartoon. And then also, if you saw the recent Dungeons and Dragons movie, which I quite enjoyed, I took my daughter and her friends, who play in the D&D group that I run for them. And, one of the parents, actually most of the parents joined us as well. And I took them to see the D&D movie, and we all had a blast. We really enjoyed it. So, but there's a scene in there that is definitely fan service, in the little maze part where they're, the main characters are running through the maze and trying to not get killed by mimics or the displacer beast. There was a scene where you see some characters, and again, live action characters, and it's the characters from this cartoon. So again, having that impact on the current culture of Dungeons and Dragons. So huge, major year, 1983. Hopefully you can understand why that's my second most important year. And again, I think an argument could be made that it is the most important year in the history and development of Dungeons and Dragons, but we're going to get to that year coming up next. Okay, this is it. My pick for the most critical year in the development of Dungeons and Dragons and the future of the hobby, and that's going to be the year 1985. So curious if anybody out there picked this as one of their years. Let me know again in the comments below. Lots of stuff going on this year. So probably the most important thing would be the release of these two books, Unearthed Arcana and Oriental Adventures. Now, once again, I have videos dedicated to each of these two books. I've run out of space to like keep tagging the videos. YouTube only lets you do 5. But every video that I've mentioned here that I've talked about a thing is going to be in my playlist. So just check out my D&D history playlist, and it's a fun one to go through and catch up on videos that maybe you haven't seen before if you're new to the channel. I've been hearing from a lot of folks lately saying that they just discovered my channel for whatever reason after all this time. YouTube finally like recommended one of my videos to them, and it showed up on their feed, and they're like, "I didn't know you existed, and I've been binging your videos," which I truly appreciate. So I really appreciate folks telling me that they're enjoying the videos and that they're, like I said, they're binging them and that they're catching up on my content. It means a lot, and I appreciate you all letting me know that. Even if I haven't had a chance to get back to you yet in the comments, please know that I did see it, and I appreciate you very much. But 1985. So this is again going to be a year where we've had now 2 years without the release of a new advanced D&D hardback. If you know your history of TSR, you know that this is also a period of time where sales for D&D peaked, I believe, in 1983. I'm pretty sure that's the year, which is another reason why that was a year in my list of like top years. I forgot to mention that. But sales start to go on the downslide. There's some financial mismanagement. There's a lot of things happening that's causing the company to lose money. And they're laying off staff. Things are going sideways. And Gary Gygax returned. This is a very short version. It's going to skip a lot of things. And also it's being told from the Gary Gygax perspective. But basically he says he didn't know that was going on. A lot of people don't believe that, but he claims that he was not aware of the financial situation of the company because he was out west in California, Los Angeles area, trying to get a D&D movie made. But once he finds out the financial straits of the company, he returns back to Lake Geneva. He assumes control of the company as president, CEO, and chairman of the board. I think he was all 3. And he appoints Lorraine Williams as like his second in command. He had met her through a mutual friend that he had out in California who was working with Gary on getting the D&D movie made. That's Flint Dille. I've talked all about this before. But in any event, Gary comes back, and the first thing he does is publish this book. So this is Unearthed Arcana. And essentially what this is a quick way to get out a new advanced Dungeons and Dragons book. Because again, it's been 2 years since you've had the revised covers of the Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, Dungeon Master's Guide, and then Legends and Lore, the old deities and demigods. And you had the new Monster Manual too. But after that, you hadn't seen anything come out for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons other than adventures and supplements, but no rule books. So this is collecting a bunch of articles that Gary wrote in Dragon Magazine, many of them not edited. Again, they're like almost inserted in here as is from Dragon Magazine, including all the errors that had been found. This book is riddled with errors, not just typos and typographic errors, but like mechanical things that don't make sense, where people looked at it and said, why does it say here this thing, but over here it says this thing, or like whatever, to the point where they have to publish errata for this in Dragon Magazine. I think it was issue number 103. To fix all the mistakes that were in this book. But that's how quickly they wanted to get this book out, because they knew that putting Gary Gygax's name on a book was going to sell copies, and they needed to make money. So this book comes out right away. So this is the first book of the 2 that comes out. And there's a lot of things in here that, again, have an impact on the game moving forward. So what are we talking about? Well, we have the expansion of different types of non-humans. So you have now you have like so you can see here, you've got dark elves coming in, you've got gray high elves, valley elves, wild elves, wood elves. You have different kinds of gnomes. You have different kinds of dwarves that are all going to be in here. That they're expanding the types of non-human classes or non-human characters, and then they're also expanding which class can be played by which race. So before it was much more limited. There's still limitations in here, but it's opening that up, and that is going to lead the way to eventually the dissolving of this separation of like saying that certain races can't play certain classes that we get in third edition. Third edition was the first edition to get rid of that. So as an example, in this version of the game, and even including into second edition, dwarfs can't be wizards. Neither can halflings. They can't be wizards or magic users. So in this version of the game, only humans, and I think they expand it to half elves in this one, can be paladins. Okay. But you also have new character classes. You have the Cavalier. So this isn't going to have that much impact on as far as a class, but it is going to have an impact on the mechanics behind this class of doing things like increasing your ability scores as you go up in level, and different abilities to like fight on horseback, and abilities to get bonuses using certain types of weapons. Those are eventually going to be things that get streamlined and consolidated and end up in the Complete Fighter's Handbook. And this idea of weapon specialization that's going to come into like second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the idea that you can get bonuses to hit and do damage with certain kinds of weapons, that again, those are going to become feats and sometimes class abilities in third edition D&D. So that all kind of starts here with the Cavalier being a very niche class, a horseback fighter, but getting these abilities and this idea of being very good at a specific thing. That's going to be a hallmark of like third edition Dungeons and Dragons, creating a character like that. Okay. But you also have the expansion of druids. You have the debut of the barbarians. Now, the barbarian class. Now, I have a whole video on barbarians, of course, but talking about, they do debut in Dragon Magazine. Like there was one in White Dwarf Magazine even before that. But officially in Dungeons and Dragons, the first time that you see it in a rule book is here, barbarians, which have been a part of the game ever since. So this is, in 1985. You have the Thief Acrobat. This is called a split class, but this is the idea that you're a thief, and thieves have certain skills: pickpockets, hide in shadows, move silently. But at a certain point, you can stop being a thief and become a split thief acrobat, and you stop advancing your traditional thief skills and you start developing new skills. And these are going to be things like tightrope walking, pole vaulting, high jumping, broad jumping, tumbling. Okay, so this is the start of this idea of like, having different kinds of thieves, or, again, what we'd call rogues, to customize what your thief is good at. And maybe you don't want to be a pickpocket. Maybe, you want to be somebody who tumbles and jumps and can walk across tightropes, things like that, more acrobatic types of things. And that's the start of this idea of customizing your thieves, because before this, every thief had the exact same types of skills, and all those skills advanced at the same level, regardless of what kind of thief you were. You just always, like, at a certain level, you got better at pickpocketing, you got better at hiding in shadows, like opening locks, all that kind of stuff. All that is going to come in here. You also have the debut of cantrips, the idea of 0 level spells. That comes in here. Now, again, almost all this debuted first in Dragon Magazine, but as far as being in a rule book where it comes into the game officially, you get that here in Unearthed Arcana. So a lot of that kind of stuff that is going to impact the game moving forward. You have different ways of generating ability scores with the idea that you are looking to create a character who is above average. Okay, so wanting to make sure that your character is better than just the regular average person out there. Okay, so you have all this kind of stuff in here. You have a whole section on weaponless combat and non-lethal combat, on non-human deities. All that is going to come in this book. So it is a hodgepodge. It is a grab bag of a bunch of different things, but it was very important at the time. It created a lot of rules that were very divisive, I would say, in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, at least in the TSR era. And talking about official rule books, not talking about supplements or optional things or whatever, but official rule books. These two right here are probably the most polarizing books in the history of TSR era Dungeons and Dragons. This one, because, again, a lot of mistakes. It does a lot to unbalance the game towards the players, the side of the players. Barbarians were very, very powerful, but also had a lot of really ridiculous limitations that were very hard to implement. One of them being things like they won't associate with magic users or magic items or things like that at lower levels. It's only at higher levels. So how are you supposed to have a mixed party with a barbarian if you also have a wizard? And a lot of people, unfortunately, what they did was ignore those types of role-playing restrictions, which then makes that class even that much more powerful because you're getting all the benefits with none of the drawbacks. Okay. The Cavalier was ridiculously overpowered as well, but in very specific types of circumstances. So a lot of people just didn't like this book. A lot of people love this book. And again, my video on that, I called it Cheer or Jeer, and it was pretty split in the comments of how many people liked this versus how many people didn't like it. Okay, so that's 1985. Now, the other book released in 1985, and I've talked about this one before, it says it's by Gary Gygax. That's a marketing thing. This is putting his name on the cover because I knew people would buy it. However, very well known that this book was majority written by Dave Cook. Okay. Dave Zeb Cook, who is the guy who wrote the expert set with Steve Marsh, did the expert set for the Moldvay Cook Marsh version of Dungeons and Dragons. Also, Dave Cook is the guy who wrote second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And that becomes very clear when you realize that in this book, and I'm not going to open this book too much because this is my only AD&D book that I have where the spine is coming apart from the pages. It's very, very loose. And I love reading this book, but I want to be very careful with it. And if you watch my video where I go through this, you'll see me talk about that a little bit. But this is the debut of non-weapon proficiencies. Comes from this book. This is the first book of Dungeons and Dragons that has this idea. So by non-weapon proficiencies, the short version of that is skills. They don't call them skills because there were weapon proficiencies that you had to take in order to learn how to use certain weapons. In advanced D&D, you didn't have classifications or groups of weapons until much later. You had to pick specific weapons, and characters got a certain number of slots at different levels to learn new weapons. And so they were applying that type of mechanic and that idea of slots and picking specific things. And so they called them non-weapon proficiencies, a very cumbersome name. But this is the debut of skills in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So non-weapon proficiencies, they don't work the way skills work in third edition or fifth edition, but the idea is the same. You are good at a certain kind of thing. And here it would be things like calligraphy or tea ceremony or fire building or tracking or all these different things, depending on what class you were. So different classes had access to different types of skills. So samurai non-weapon proficiencies are going to be a different list than barbarian non-weapon proficiencies, but you pick from those lists and then you get good at those things. And those are things that you can do. And the rules in here tell you how to apply that skill during a game. So before this existed, a player would say, can I track that guy? Now, you had Rangers and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Don't get too caught up on that. Let's say a character might say, do I know how to sail this boat down the river? And then the dungeon master might have a moment talking with that player like, well, tell me about your character's background. Did they grow up near the river or, on the ocean? Do they have any kind of sailing experience? You would talk it out and figure out, was that part of your character's background? And then the DM would make a ruling and you would move on. Now you have specific rules that will tell you, well, I picked that I know how to maneuver small watercraft on rivers versus oceans versus lakes. And so I know how to do that. And then you knew that your character could do that, which then implies that any character that doesn't have that can't do it. So that's why I say having more options actually leads to fewer options, because before you start delineating what skills your character had, your character could have that skill if the DM thought it was reasonable for you to have that. And then the DM would make up the rule, and it was usually a roll under mechanic. So they might say, okay, it seems reasonable that you would know how to do this. Roll your whatever it is, your dexterity score, your ability score, or whatever on a D20. And if you get that score lower, then you succeed. That's why having a higher ability score would be good. Okay, so, but that's the debut of non-weapon proficiencies in this book. So that had an impact on this game going forward. The same system that's in here is very, very close to the system, I should say, is going to then debut in the Dungeoneer Survival Guide and the Wilderness Survival Guide. I've talked about those two books before, both in the same video, and they expand the use of non-weapon proficiencies in those two books, and then it gets brought into second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And again, like I said, they say it's optional in that book, but it's a core part of that game. And most people were going to use them at that point. And now skills are just ubiquitous. I've had people tell me, how could you play the game without skills? Like, skills was a necessary and important part of the game. I am not one of the people that say that. So you guys know, if you watch my channel long enough, I run 1981 BX, Moldvay Cook Marsh, basic Dungeons and Dragons for my daughter and her friends. There are no skills in that game, and we do just fine. So it's very possible to play that way. And I don't know that you need skills to help define your character. You can define your character through other things other than mechanic-based skills, but that's a whole other thing. Okay, so that's non-weapon proficiencies. What else is going on in 1985? Well, 1985 is finally going to see the release, after I think like 7 years of waiting, of the super module T1 through 4, the Temple of Elemental Evil. So this was intended to be the sequel to T1 Village of Hamlet, and it was teased for years that this was coming out, and it never did. It never did. So the T module, there was T1 Village of Hamlet that came out in like maybe 78, 79, something like that, and there was never a sequel to it, even though it was set up that you would go to the Temple of the Elemental Evil. So finally, in 1985, you have the release of this super module, again called T1 through 4, the Temple of Elemental Evil finally gets released. And that was a big deal at the time when this was released, that people were finally able to get access to this adventure that Gary Gygax had been teasing. So kind of an interesting thing just in terms of numbering and releases of adventures and things like that. 1985 is also going to see the release of an adventure by Gary Gygax, WG6, Isle of the Ape, which is sort of a play on like Skull Island and King Kong. There's like a demi-plane involved and things like that. So the adventure itself, to me, is not all that memorable. I just think it's interesting. It's WG6. Well, the WG series of modules, that WG stands for World of Greyhawk. And the WG series starts with WG4, the Lost Temple of Thurisdan. I think that's the name of that particular module. There is no WG1, 2, and 3. Interestingly enough. So it starts with WG4, and I'm just bringing that up. Here's a little bit of trivia for you. So the reason that it was labeled as WG4 is because the Village of Hamlet was originally intended to be labeled as WG1. And then the follow-up sequel was going to be WG2, the Temple of Elemental Evil. And then originally the Lost Caverns of Sojkanth, which is finally published and labeled as module S4. It was originally supposed to be WG3. And then WG4, Lost Temple of Thurisdan, they were supposed to kind of go together. It was like a sequence. So, however, the Village of Hamlet, when it is finally published, it is not labeled as WG1. As you know, it was labeled as T1. T2 was never published ever. And then Lost Caverns of Sojkanth ends up being published as S4. So it's kind of just an interesting little thing behind the scenes if you've ever wondered why WG4 is labeled as that and there was no WG1, 2, and 3. So that's also released. You also have the release in 1985 of the battle system. So this was another thing that had been promised for a long time and a lot of people were waiting for. This is a miniature war game written with the rules of Dungeons and Dragons in mind so that you could move from individual one-on-one combat and run armies, going back to the war game roots and chainmail and things like that preceded Dungeons and Dragons. So going back to that, and it was, again, it's a box set, but this version of battle system impacted the adventures that were being published. So then, and also in 1985, you have the release of H1 Bloodstone Pass, which was a module intended to be played using the battle system rules. You have X9, the Savage Coast, that's for the basic D&D system. But then you also have X10, Red Arrow, Black Shield, or Black Arrow, Red Shield, whatever that was. Red Arrow, Black Shield. And that module is written for the non-advanced version of Dungeons and Dragons, but it is made to be used with the battle system rules. So the battle system thing was intended to be a very big, important release in the history of D&D. And so you see all these things being released in 1985 as a way, and a lot of them were ideas by Gary Gygax as a way to, like, again, right the ship and get these products out there so that people would start buying things and help the company be more solvent again, because it was like hemorrhaging money, unfortunately, again, due to some mismanagement. So Battle System, again, was teased for a long time, ads in Dragon Magazine, and it was intended to be a very big thing. It ends up not being a big thing. It doesn't really stick around that long. Over the years, Dungeons and Dragons has several times attempted to try to publish a miniature war game, a massive army system to be used, built on the chassis of the main rule system that was published at the time. So third edition had a revision of Chainmail that attempted to do that, and they just never really catch on. I think that there's a portion of people that are interested in that kind of play, but most people at these days don't seem to. They prefer more like the kind of like playing the superhero type and not the idea of I'm leading an army type. So that's 1985. So all these products come out. I said a lot of them under the direction or the oversight and the ideas by Gary Gygax. However, the other big thing that's going to happen in 1985, we're going to see Gen Con move from Lake Geneva to Milwaukee because they needed more space. So Gen Con was becoming much bigger and they needed a bigger space. So this was a big deal because Gen Con, the Gen, G-E-N, that's named after Lake Geneva. And so moving it to Milwaukee is kind of goofy, but that's what they did. Again, because they needed more space. Okay. However, I think maybe the big thing that happened at TSR from a business standpoint in 1985 is that in October of that year, the same month that this book comes out, pretty sure this came out in October of 85, Gary Gygax is going to walk into a meeting, a board meeting at TSR, where he is intending to reiterate his plans for the company and look at removing certain individuals, including Kevin Bloom, who was Brian Bloom's brother, who was in charge of finances, I believe, at the time, and solidify his position in the company. He's going to walk out of that meeting having been voted off the board, realizing that he has lost control of the company that he helped create because Lorraine Williams has made a backroom deal to buy the shares of the Bloom brothers and some of her own shares, which give her over 50% ownership in the company. This is all done, and Gary is stripped of his titles as president, as CEO, as chairman of the board, and he is told that no longer will the creative direction of the company be under his jurisdiction. So any projects that he was working on, including like second edition Dungeons and Dragons, any plans that he had for releasing new products, that was all gone. Now, that's a very short version of that meeting. The meeting is actually longer, and it's a very interesting look at how companies are run and how mismanagement was responsible for what happened at TSR, these backroom dealings, again, like all that kind of stuff. And basically how Gary was sadly ambushed. It's too bad that he couldn't have seen this coming. And when you look at what was going on and the things that he said to people and that kind of thing, it looks like he might have been able to sort of read between the lines and figure this out. However, he was completely blindsided and didn't have a response for what was going on. So he is essentially voted out. He stays on as a member of the board. That's the only thing that he's left with, is he stays on the board because he owns shares in the company. However, he is going to sell his shares to the company in 1986. And at that point, he's no longer going to be part of this thing that he created, this game and its campaign worlds and settings, and the company of Dungeons and Dragons and Gen Con. All those things are all going to go away. So I mentioned before, there's a very interesting podcast you can listen to. It's called When We Were Wizards. I'll try to remember to put a link down in the show notes. And there is an episode of that podcast where they have the minutes from that board meeting, and they actually hire some voice actors to read the different parts of that meeting. And when you hear it being said out loud, especially the guy who is playing the part of Gary Gygax, because obviously Gary's passed away now, but reading what Gary said during that meeting, it's heartbreaking. Whatever you think about Gary, he was a flawed person like everybody is. And did and said some things that I don't necessarily agree with. However, what happened to him in that meeting and how this company was taken from him, and how you can hear how shocked he was, it really affected me. And I highly encourage you to listen to that podcast. So that's why I picked 1985 as being a crucial year in the development of advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or just Dungeons and Dragons in general, and role-playing games in general, is the debut of all the things that we talked about in these books that impact the game in the future, but also the change in the direction of the company itself, and moving forward without one of the people that founded it and created the game that they were selling. So that's a big deal. And it's why I picked this as, again, my number one year. But I would definitely love to hear what your thoughts are, what years you would have picked. Again, did you agree with any of mine or disagree? Did I leave something out? Again, for every year that I talked about, I know there was other things going on that I didn't touch on. I just touched on a couple of the key ones. So just to try to give you a flavor. But definitely leave your thoughts in the comments below to what you think. And then while you're down there, you'll see in the show notes places where you can join me on social media, connect with me there. You can follow my blog. You can also support my channel. There's two important ways that you can support my channel. The first is by buying an exclusive design only available at my shop, like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, and notebook with tabletop role-playing game designs and other things that might be of interest to you, other designs. And then also you can become a super fan. Here's a list of some people that have done that. This is another great way that you can help support the channel if you are financially able to do so. And I appreciate everyone who has done it so far. And I also just wanted to say also thank you to the folks who have reached out in the comments to wish me condolences for the passing of my dad last month. It's been almost a month. Tomorrow will be a month. Today is January 20th. And of 2025. So, and he passed away on the 21st of December. So I really appreciate everyone who offered their thoughts and let me know that they really appreciated the like the tribute that I did to him in one of my previous bonus contents. That means a lot to me that you even stuck around and watched that. And thank you so much for that. And also the people that will give us well wishes to my family for all the fires that we're having down here. I'm very, very close to the Eaton Canyon fire, and my family did evacuate. We are back home now, and we still have a home, but so many people don't. And friends of ours that lived in these homes for 30 or more years, and their kids have no home, and they're expected to go to school, and they have no clothes. And we've been doing what we can, and But it's just devastating. And so I really appreciate all the words of support from all of you that appreciated the fact that with everything going on, I was still trying to put videos out. That means a lot to me that you recognize the struggle and that you appreciate it and that you get enjoyment out of these, because that gives me happiness. And so I appreciate that. So with that said, I'm going to move into the giveaway thing. So I'm going to redo my giveaway because the first two winners didn't get in touch with me. I had no way of getting in touch with them. I tried several different ways. And so I'm going to pick two new winners for that. And but before that, I would like to say thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. Okay, so here is my revised drawing for the giveaway that I did. So this was from my 100th video that I made, and at the in that video I mentioned that I would be giving away my old copies of the 1978 Gamma World box set game, role-playing game that was released by TSR in 1978, and my old version of the Boot Hill second edition, which I want to say was released in 1979. My international winner did get in touch with me, so I'm going to be in the process of sending them the gift card that I mentioned. But for the Gamma World and Boot Hill contest, I had 106 people enter the contest. And the idea is that the first name that I draw here, draw in quotes, they're going to get their pick of whether they want Gamma World or Boot Hill. And then the name that I draw second, that person will get whatever the first winner didn't take. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to use my Amazon device over here to pick a number. So Alexa, Pick a number between 1 and 106.
Here's a number between 1 and 106. It's 25.
25. Okay, so rate Neff. I guess I don't know how to pronounce that, but there you go. RATENEF. So you are the first place winner. Let me just write that down. And now let's pick the second one. Alexa, pick a number between 1 and 106.
Here's a number between 1 and 106. It's 86.
86. Ed Jarosek 4317. Okay, so you are the second place winner. So I will try to see if you have a email address or anything associated with your YouTube name here, your YouTube profile. If not, I need to ask you guys, please get in touch with me. So you can find me on social media, you can tag me, or just send me an email and let me know who you are and that you won. And for the first place person, that rate Neff person, let me know what you're picking, whether you want Gamma World or Boot Hill. And then once you pick, I will let the other winner here know, the number 86, know that they get the other one. Okay. So congrats to both of you. Thanks for entering. Thanks for your interest in my contest. And I appreciate it. And I'll be doing more giveaways coming up. I try to save them for special occasions. This was my 100th video, so it seemed like a pretty good occasion to do that. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I have been thinking about this video for a long time, and I've gone through various different things that I'm listening to, but most recently, I decided to spin this particular album here. Now, interestingly enough, well, I don't know if it's interesting. I'm not a big Flaming Lips fan. I'm just not. I've seen them in concert, saw them at the Hollywood Bowl. I saw them at the Wiltern, or no, the Wiltern. It wasn't the Wiltern, but it was another club close to that area, like near La Brea and Wilshire. I forget the name of that little club over there, but I used to work over in that area. And they're fine. It's just not music that really grabs me. However, this particular album, a lot of people consider it to be their best album. I don't have a lot of context for that because, again, I don't literally explore their catalog too often. However, there is a song on this album, Feeling Yourself Disintegrate, and it's really speaking to me right now, particularly. So Wayne Coyne from Flaming Lips has said that he wrote that song as his father was dying from cancer. And again, if you guys have been watching the channel for the last few weeks, you know that my dad passed away from cancer about a month ago. And he'd been sick for a long time, but I mean, he drove over to our house for Thanksgiving and had dinner with us, and everything seemed fine. And then less than 3 weeks later, he was gone. And, so I've been trying to process that. This album, also this particular song here at the end, it's just not the typical, there's a change in this album. This comes out in 1999, I want to say. And the Flaming Lips with this album, they kind of get away from some of that, I think, gimmicky stuff. Other people would disagree. And I'm not trying to say, again, I'm not a Flaming Lips fan. That doesn't mean I don't appreciate their talent. It's just not for me. But this one gets a little bit deeper, and there's some soul searching in here, and there's some music that's not necessarily radio friendly. It's not like it's going to get on any, like top listening to, any like charting, that kind of stuff. But I really appreciated the switch that they changed in this album to be a little bit more introspective. And again, this particular track here, Feeling Yourself Disintegrate, it's also just a really nicely produced album. It sounds great. This is my copy from Vinyl Me Please. And it came with all these extra goodies. There's, the Obi strip, of course. And then there's this kind of, you can see it. I guess hopefully it's getting picked up here on the camera. Which I thought was really cool. And then there's some original artwork here in the back. It's like now you can actually check it out. So, if you think you don't like Flaming Lips, and like I said, I'm kind of one of those people, maybe give this one a try and see what you think. And, a song can't necessarily help you deal with loss, but it can help you process and maybe think about some of the emotions that you're trying to express. And so if you are doing that yourself, maybe play this particular track and see what you think. Okay, so that's that. Now, something else I wanted to show you was what I was drinking. My dad, oddly, I guess, was a big rum fan, which is kind of sounds a little cliche considering that he was in the Navy. But we've been cleaning out his old apartment and have found probably 5 or 6 different types of rum in his apartment. As a kind of contrast to that, he had 1 bottle of bourbon and 1 bottle of rye. In my home bar, I've currently have 3 different bottles of bourbon, 2 different ryes, and about 3 or 4 different gins, and 1 bottle of rum. So just to complete, and that bottle of rum is one that my dad gave me. So now this is one that I did have. Actually, so I guess I have 2 bottles of rum. I stand corrected. But this is technically slightly different. This is RHUM Agricole. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that because I don't speak French. So I bought this actually for my holiday party last month in December. Every year my family has a holiday party. And this year, the theme of our party was the Star Wars Holiday Special, which I picked, much to the chagrin of my wife. I did that. And then, of course, I came up with some gimmicky drinks. And I think I showed my menu on here before. But one of the ones that I did, what I call the Mai Tai, but it was Tai T-I-E, like Twin Ion Engine. From the Imperial TIE Fighters. And Mai Tais use, the one I made used this as part of the base, along with some regular rum as well. So RHUM Agricole, the difference between RHUM Agricole and rum RHUM, this is rum RHUM Agricole. The difference is that regular rum is produced from sugarcane, but using mostly from molasses. And RHUM Agricole is produced from fresh pressed sugarcane juice. So a lot of people will say that regular rum or traditional rum has a sweeter characteristic to it, whereas RHUM Agricole is a little bit like funkier or earthier or more vegetal. So, but this one is particularly smooth, it says, and it's balanced for sweetness and character. So this is from Martinique, which is a former French colony or whatever you want to call it. But anyway, so I use this in my Mai Tais. I don't normally just sip rum neat. Thanks for sharing this with me. I just thought it would be fun to try it neat and see what we have here. So, you definitely get that funk, that kind of earthy funk on the nose. And that's not a bad thing. So there are certain wines like Pinot Noir. A lot of people will say they're funky, and that's actually that's a feature. It's not a bug. A lot of times you're looking for that. Some people will say it smells like barnyard, which again sounds bad. It doesn't taste that way. It's just on the nose, and sometimes it can be very desirable as a characteristic that you're looking for on the nose. This one doesn't have that level of funk, but it definitely has some kind of funkiness going on. It is pretty sweet, but not overwhelmingly so. It's not like our traditional rum. Like they said, it is balanced, and I do find it balanced. There's that little bit of alcohol burn. There's some spices. There's some caramel. There's some vanilla. This is coming from like the charred barrels that they place it in. It's aged very, very similarly to like an American bourbon. And it does have a little bit of bourbon quality to it, interestingly enough. A little bit of spice. That's very interesting. Again, I'm not someone who drinks rum on the regular, but I am trying to expand my palate a little bit, given that my dad seemed to be really into it. So normally when I had drinks with my dad, he was a big fan of Manhattan. He loved a Boulevardier, and he really liked martini with either olives or lemon twist. I prefer lemon twist. He liked aviation. So when I drank with him, it was mostly in the gin or the bourbon or sometimes rye family. So I don't recall having a lot of rum-based drinks with him. So I found it interesting that he had so many different bottles of rum in his apartment. Okay, I think that's enough for this bonus content. I've kind of talked long enough here, but thank you for staying through with it and to listen and watch, and I really appreciate it. And cheers to you, and I will talk to you next time.